If you're new to sewing, you might have come across the term interfacing or stabilize, and it's left you thinking, what's that? And headed to Google and try to Google it, and so much information, right? Maybe that's how you ended up on this video. And no worse when you go to the store, there's way too many choices. In this video, let's demystify what interfacing is, fusing, stabilizers, what the different types are, when and where to use them, to give you some better information, better insight into this sewing term of interfacing that we do, why we do it, because you do not want to miss this step on your sewing, particularly in garments, just because you don't know what it is. We're here to demystify all of the interfacing, stabilizing, fusing questions. This is probably one of the things, top things on the what the pattern envelope doesn't tell you about, is interfacing. Because you read this for the first time and you're thinking, what on earth is that? And then of course, don't let me get started when you go into the store and there's just so many different choices and they're all called different things and you're just thinking, what do I need? Do I even need it? What's stabilizing even for? And then you get yourself into a whole mess. So I know it's one of the big questions that I had when I first started, or things I missed because I didn't know, and it was a disaster. And it's come up recently in some of my more recent videos as we've been talking about, beginner sewing. How do we get started sewing? We've talked about it's one of the biggest things missing on the actual envelope, and there was a few really great questions that come through in the comments about, what is a stabilizer, when and where we need it, interfacing, what, why, how. So let's go over all those things. Let's cover what stabilizing is, what it isn't, what interfacing is used for, all the different types of interfacing that there are and what they might be used for. And then we'll also go into how to choose the best kind, for your garment, etc., to give you a bit more a helping hand when you're next choosing it. And then of course what I do and recommend for maybe as well recommendations to move forward for if you're looking for some suggestions that go in line with my top tips as well. But let's first start with what is stabilizing. So we use stabilizers, which can be an interfacing, but we want to stabilize fabric for either to stop pulling, to stop draping, to stop stretching, to stop movement in the fabric basically. And so interfacing is one way that we can stabilize. Stabilizing can be done with different methods as well, because you could stabilize a seam, you could stabilize the fabric entirely, and you could use seam tape. So sometimes tapes are sewn into seams to stabilize it. You could use interfacings, all the different kinds, which we'll get to. You could use a spray-on starch to stabilize all the fabric, like a drapey fabric, and then stabilize it while you're sewing it and washes out, etc. So that's stabilizing and what we need. We're going to talk about the interfacing part because that's what we're here for. So interfacing is used to stabilize, and it's also used to give structure and body to a garment. For instance, this lovely one here would absolutely not look the same if it didn't have interfacing in the collar. The collar would be all flat, it'd probably be wrinkly, the corners would not be sharp and nice crease. The neckline would not have this nice firm crease to it and crispness and stay up. It could have stretched out very easily. It won't be sitting like this at all. This is why we use interfacing, is to give structure and body to certain areas, and we'll talk about that later, and to give stability to fabric as well. Okay, let's cover off the different types of interfacing. So you have, let's start with the two main types. You either have fusible interfacing, so iron-on interfacing, or sew-in interfacing. So iron-on interfacing, or fusing, or fusible interfacing, all these types of names you might use, or fusing is often just called. It is a type of interfacing that has a sort of glue on the inside. I think you can see it on this one. Basically, it's got one side that is sort of glue, and so what happens is you lay that down on your fabric, you iron it, so basically you melt the glue and it sticks to your fabric, and so that's how it provides its stability, by sticking to the fabric. On the other hand, you have what's called a sew-in interfacing. And this is no glue, no nothing, is the more old-fashioned kind, because before all these beautiful fusible type interfacings were done, it was only sew in interfacing. And so you literally sew it in. So usually you'd cut out your piece, say your collar for example, and then you would cut out the same piece of interfacing and sew around the edges to hold them together, so it's like one piece of fabric after that. So the same principle, it's just a different way to get to the same result. And so within here, within the types of interfacing, there are both woven and non-woven interfacings. So woven interfacings are as they suggest, just like woven fabric, but they have one side with this sort of glue, if you will, on the side of it that makes it. You'll know it's woven because it will literally have threads that come off just like your fabric does, and you'll see it, all the strands, the wefts and the warps, all the different threads. Yeah, you understand, right? So it's woven just like woven fabric. And the non-woven is kind of, think of it more like a mat or a web of fibers that are all, you know, laid out, and then the glue's applied on top. And you'll know because generally these ones are the ones that you can tear. So they just tear apart because there's no actual threads holding it together, so to say. It's a non-woven. And now all of these have their different places. Talk about that in just a second, because there is also one more, and that is knit. So you can get knit interfacing. It's generally, you know, it doesn't really stretch so much because the idea is that you want to stabilize these areas. You only sort of use these things in, you know, stable knits, etc. And they're quite loose woven and just provide a little bit of structure and support to a knit fabric sometimes. So there are those as well. So they all do have different uses and places. And I'll get to my recommendations, what I like, but you know, fusible interfacings are good because they basically form one with the fabric, and you'll get less wrinkles because it mats the fabric up entirely. So it's less wrinkles, it's like really nice and solid piece of fabric, right? On the downside, it can be a too solid piece of fabric. You don't want cardboard, we want fabric still. And so you can easily make it too stiff and rigid with a fusible interfacing. And sewing interfacings are really great because they're generally, you know, woven, and so it gives more of a fabric type feel. Even with the fusible interfacings, the woven ones are usually more higher end, more expensive usually as well, of course. But they do provide more of a fabric-like feel to the garment instead of the non-wovens. And the sew-in ones don't actually add any kind of like glue or anything to your fabric, and so if it's what you're looking for, sew-ins are great. But they have different uses, and I use all of them, which I'll tell you about in a minute. I hope that briefly explains all the different types of interfacings, what you're looking at when you look at them. Okay, so just where do we usually use interfacing for? So you'll want to use interfacing on any facings. You get it? Interfacing for facings that you have, because all the facings need some extra structure and support, because facings are generally at areas like necklines, at openings like button openings, etc., cuffs, collars. All of these are generally, they're like big ones that we usually interface because we want structure on them. Think any ends. We don't usually do hems because they usually hang, right? And often they're folded up twice, etc. But they're more hanging and not meant to have structure. But if you put a cuff on it, that cuff definitely needs structure. So anytime it tells you interface, you know, don't skip it, because it's very important for the garment to look really nice and crisp. It's all of the other little parts that you need, little teeny pieces that you're sewing onto it, like collars and cuffs, or necklines or openings. Think all of those areas are where we mostly use the interfacing. As I said, there's a whole world, and you should definitely do some more research, but this is a top level kind of, when you go into the store, you can actually start seeing, woven, non-woven, fusible, non-fusible, etc. All right, but then when you're at the store, how do you choose the right interfacing? All right, let's go from here. The number one overarching rule of how you would choose the right interfacing for what you're making is you want the right weight to match the fabric that you are using. You don't want, like I said before, you don't want cardboard fabric. So a lightweight fabric needs a lightweight interfacing. A heavyweight wool will need a really heavy and more structured interfacing to match it, right? We're trying to match the fabric that we're using. Generally, you would go lighter, not too heavy, and your fusibles, as I said, have that cardboard tendency, so lighter is better. And so you just match it to your fabric. And by weight, we mean the thickness, really. So it can be a bit hard to tell sometimes when you're just brand new, but have a look at it. You'll see, is the interfacing kind of more like a quilting cotton like this one? It's not far off, right? A little bit lighter. But then something like this one is actually even lighter, like it's more sheer and it feels like almost paperweight, right? So this would maybe be more suitable for really, really lightweight cotton, voile, etc. So trying to match it to the fabric that you're going for. That's the main overarching way that you will choose what is the appropriate interfacing. Then you'll start, do you want a fusible or a sew-in? Now, I recommend that you probably just start with a fusible interfacing because one, your pattern is probably going to use those instructions and tell you how to do it. And that is, if you look online for any kinds of like self-learn tutorial, Google anything, that's probably what you're going to see. So it'll be the easiest to get started with, I think, a fusible interfacing, and they are really great. And then I would look at maybe moving to sew-in interfacings when you get a bit more experienced and kind of have a bit more of idea of what you're actually trying to achieve. Unless that is you're trying to go for historically accurate sewing, then obviously sew-in with natural fibers is probably what you're looking for, but you already know that. Okay, here's my hot tips on interfacing and fusing, what you should do from here. So not all interfacings are created equal. There's definitely different qualities and it's really hard to tell. You only really know until you get home and you use it. I've had some that just like they iron on and it takes the hottest temperature, ridiculous amount of time to try and like fuse them and melt them on, and they still bubble and bubble and pucker. And then when you wash them, they kind of get that bubbling feel, like terrible, terrible quality. You don't want those ones, right? You only know by using them, or some shrink. So go for brand names if you can. It's always obviously a good starting point. When you find one you like, the next tip is to then buy in bulk, because this is one thing, like you never want to go buying this like per project. You want this in your stash absolutely at all times. So buy in bulk. When you find one that is good and you know works, buy a couple of meters. Usually, at least in garment sewing, the pieces that we use are quite small. So 2 or 3 meters is like, that will be many projects, right? And so think about then buying in bulk, usually getting a medium weight. So something for, say, your medium weight fabrics, and then a lightweight one for your lightweight fabrics. Generally, like all of our garment sewing, for 95% of us, will probably fall into that category. Stiffer ones, if you do things like jackets, coats, etc., or you're making bags and things like that, will require a stiffer, heavier one. But generally, a lightweight and a medium weight, and just buy a couple in bulk when you find your one, will be absolutely perfect. I would also suggest, if you're up for it, to get a medium weight hair canvas or sew-in interfacing. Now, this can either be sew-in interfacing like this one, or this natural hair canvas. I really like these ones the very most. It's a natural hair product, and it's more of a tailoring type thing. For my Australian girls, you can get this at Spotlight, and it just gives a really nice, I find it just it feels like fabric because it basically is, right? And so things like waistbands, I love using this in waistbands, and anything you need a real structured piece to, but you want it to feel like fabric. This is great because you can the hot tip is you can use a super lightweight fusible on the actual garment to keep that like wrinkle free, etc., and rigidity in the fabric itself, and then use this for the structure for certain things, like, as I said, waistbands are probably one of the big ones for that. A medium weight sew-in canvas will really work because we all pretty much do different waistbands of things, and different areas might need something quite structured, and that is really good. So if you have the two, but then maybe that third one, the sew-in, as just that little extra. And the last tip as you build your interfacing, supply cabinet full, is to get both black and white. Yes, it does come in black, and it is handy because you don't really want to be fusing white onto dark colored garments. Of course, if dark colored garments are all that you sew, then just get the black or just get the white. But basically, in that same brand, the one that that works, if you can get both black and white, as you're building your interfacing collection, it will serve you well. I would really love to know down in the comments below what has been your biggest challenges with interfacings, fusing, stabilizers. Let me know because I can make some more videos on this topic. And if you have a great one, let us know what your ultimate interfacing is down below too. give someone else a nice hot tip on where to find that as well, because we are a sewing community here and we're all sharing our information to try and just make sew better garment. Okay, let's take this to the community. In the comments down the bottom, I would love to know what has been your biggest challenges with interfacings, fusings, all the things. Leave those comments down below because I might just make some more videos on it. I'd love to hear what your challenges are. Or what's been your biggest takeaway from this one? I'd love to know how I've helped you, because I really do want to see you sewing those clothes that you dream of. If you want more information, expand further on this, this is what I do in Vintage Sewing School. So there's links down in the description box. Click the little link, drops down, and I'd love to have you come join me there. I can even have a free class. Okay, until next time, my sewing friends, happy sewing. Bye.